Hi guys! So today was the first day of school in Phoenix and it feels really weird not to be there. You know, it was about like 7:25 a.m. and I was like, you know, I would have held up a plastic foot right about now, and I just have a lot of feelings about not being there, and I miss them. I miss my bulldog family. About a month ago, I wrote something as part of a reflection for the summer program that I was a part of. We had to read this list of racial identity development by Beverly Tatum. It was a really interesting read. I'd seen it before during like other trainings. It was interesting to me that 2 years ago, when I read the same piece of paper, I was at a very different place. It was interesting for me to like reflect on how teaching has affected my own idea of what race means, what my own identity means, and what that means in like the larger scope of education. But I guess, disclaimer, if you don't want to listen to me talk about my identity and my race, I'll see you later. But if that's something that you do want to, then stick around. Just know that when I am using quotes or saying quotes, it's from that text that I had to reflect on, and if you would like to read it for yourself, I will leave a link for that down below, so you can go check it out and read it if you are interested. The only people who ever bullied me were Indian. It was in New Jersey, and I was different. But that was stage 2, so let me start at stage 1. Stage 1, and I quote, pre-encounter. The individual seeks to assimilate and be accepted by whites and actively or passively distances themselves from the other persons of her own race. This de-emphasis on one's racial group membership may allow the individual to think that race has not been or will not be a relevant factor in one's own achievement. End quote. I didn't believe in racism until I felt it. When I moved to the United States, I didn't think that the pale-faced blonde kid that I was sitting next to at lunch thought of me as less than him, or that the pale-faced blonde girl sitting next to him would either. I mean, she had a Japanese lunchbox. I thought that my teacher moved me into an advanced math class without testing me to be nice. I thought that the 3 tests that I had to take to test into honors English were a coincidence. I thought that the absence of praise from my science classes and the abundance of it in my English classes was normal. My English teachers must just be nicer people than my science teachers. I didn't think much of it because white people never really made me feel different. It was Indian kids who made fun of my clothes and my hair and my accent and my habits. It was Indians who needed to make it very obvious that even though we shared the same heritage, I was in fact very different from them. That was the first time I was ever bullied because of my race. And that brings me to stage 2, and I quote, encounter. Movement into this phase is typically precipitated by an event or series of events that forces the individual to acknowledge the impact of racism in one's life. Faced with the reality that he or she cannot truly be white, the individual is forced to focus on his or her identity as a member of a group targeted by racism. My presence, my very Indian presence, forced the other, more Americanized Indian kids to confront the fact that they aren't white, that there's nothing they can do to look like anybody on the cover of the magazines they read or the shows that they watch. They will never be able to hide their dark-skinned lips under gobs of shiny pink lip smackers. No matter how much spaghetti they eat at lunch, they're still gonna eat aloo gobi for dinner. No amount of crushing on the Aaron Carters and the Justin Timberlakes of our school is gonna change the fact that those boys are gonna go out with the Hillary Duffs and Britney Spearses. So they pushed, and I pushed back, and then they pushed some more. And then I moved to Arizona. And then I was the only Indian kid I knew until I got to high school. And by then, I had assimilated enough that nobody really felt the need to distance themselves from me anymore. Did I say assimilated? I meant that I internalized racism. I became a bully. I listened to a substitute teacher call India a dirty country filled with dirty people and spent the next 10 minutes internally making a list of how my family is in fact very different from that. I got to college and I went to one event by the ISA, the Indian Student Association, and I never went to anything they organized again. I always detoured around the engineering buildings on my way to class because I didn't want to walk next to the Indian grad students. I wanted to make it very obvious that even though we share the same heritage, they are in fact very different from me. I think that all this came from the mixed messages that I was receiving as I grew up. On the one hand, Indian food tastes really good, but on the other hand, Indian people stink of spices all the time. On the one hand, it's trendy to do yoga and hang up tapestries in your room, and on the other hand, Indian medicine has no merit because it's not rooted in Western science. On one hand, you've got white girls wearing bindis at Coachella, and on the other hand, Nina the Voolery doesn't deserve to be Miss America because she looks too foreign. Are you vegetarian? Are you going to get an arranged marriage? Let me guess. Biomedical engineering? I felt ashamed to be Indian. I started hating being Indian. So I clinged to dominant white culture, hoping that I'd be so convincing that people would just forget that I'm not white. I regressed to stage 1. And then I became a teacher. I became a teacher to a bunch of Latino and Black kids. I became a teacher and I loved my students. And I heard them say things like, math is for white people and stop acting white, when their peers were just being articulate. How are my students going to take over the civil rights movement if they don't see their own identities as something worth fighting for? So we talked about race. We talked about cops, graduation rates, diversity. We talked, on Tuesdays mostly, about how we could be better to each other and lift each other up. They saw their backgrounds as a source of strength, not as something that's incompatible with the systems in place around them. I started to see my own background as a source of strength, not as something incompatible with the systems in place around me. They saw code switching as power. So did I. They thought it was unfair that there's a dominant narrative about their culture in the US. So did I. In working so sincerely to show my students that they deserve everything they want without having to give up an ounce of who they are, they showed me what it looks like for somebody to do that. And that's something I'd never seen before. They set an example for me. And if any of my students are watching this, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for being brave and having honest discussions with each other and doing all the weird things that I would make you do that you weren't used to seeing in your math class. Without having taught you and learning from you, I would have never gotten to stage 4, and I quote, internalization. In this stage, secure in one's own sense of racial identity, there's less need to assert their own race. The internalized individual is willing to establish meaningful relationships with whites who acknowledge and are respectful of his or her self-definition. The individual is ready to build coalitions with members of other oppressed groups. Earlier this year, I knew where I needed to go. I needed to create a space where people heard from people like my students and saw them as equals. I need people to see us as equals. Thanks for watching.